Okay, well, welcome everyone. It looks like we have some people beginning to join us, and we're very cognizant of the time, so we want to make sure that we honor the time that you have spent with us. Um, I'd just like to begin just with some introductions and welcoming everyone to our third PLN of this professional learning series. My name is Jennifer Vieira, and I am a principal in the Dufferin-Peel Catholic District School Board. And I'm joined today with my colleagues, Anna Mena, who's principal with the Trillium Lakelands District School Board, Dr. Christine Sertram, who is the lead researcher involved with our new mathematics curriculum, and also Luciana Cardarelli, who joins us from CPCO. So thank you to everyone for taking the time today to join us. Today's session is going to have us spend a little bit of time up front, just engaged in some hopefully new learning for you. And then we're going to move into some smaller breakout groups afterwards to continue the conversation. So at this time, I would also like to remind anyone who would like to access the closed caption feature to please do so just at the bottom of your screen by selecting on closed caption or enabling your live transcript. Brad, if I'll just get you to advance our slide, we're going to begin with our land acknowledgement. So I would like to begin by acknowledging the ancestral lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit, where I am speaking to you from today. And we are very grateful to the Mississauga people for their stewardship of this land. Isaac Murdoch is a gentleman who has spent much time in our Dufferin-Peel School Board, helping us to learn about the Anishinaabe histories, the people, and the ongoing presence of the Anishinaabe Nation on our lands. And he reminds us, and I've placed the quote on the screen for you, that we are invited into this beautiful blanket of life. And I particularly connect to this quote because this is an important reflection for us as it speaks to our responsibilities as invited guests to this land and to be gracious of the privilege that we have to inhabit these lands. I would also like to acknowledge and invite everyone to acknowledge the lands on which you have been invited to or are participating today, and you can do so by typing it into the chat. Okay, so Brad, if you could just advance the slide. We're going to ask you at this time to do a couple things. As you're acknowledging the lands on which you are participating today, we'd also ask you to introduce yourself in the chat. So we encourage you to be able to introduce, say hello, let us know what board you are from, and also what role you play within the board. Just make sure that your selection is on panelists and attendees so that everyone in the group today can see your responses. So today, we're basically going to continue our journey in discussions around some high-impact instructional practices in math. So this particular document that we're going to explore today allows us to take a look at what is it that is informing a teacher's pedagogical moves, and what can we do as leaders in order to think about how we can support teachers as they try to implement these ideas in their classrooms. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to my colleague.
Thank you so much, Jen. So today we're going to be talking about math conversations and small group instruction. We're drawing from this particular document, as Jen said, about high impact instructional practices in mathematics. And if you haven't seen this document yet, it's available on the curriculum website, actually, under resources. And it's a very handy document because you can sort of open to any page, and it gives you quite a bit of information that you could work with your staff on. And nice short descriptions of some of these practices. And so we'll be talking about some of these with a view to what might you do with this document with your colleagues. So if we go to the next page, I'm going to be talking about the segment that's on math conversations. Sometimes I'll be drawing from the document as it is, and other times I'll be highlighting some specific other resources or research that I draw on that actually supports these ideas. So we know that conversations of math actually build students' understanding as they listen and respond to not only the teacher's thinking, but the other students' expression of mathematical ideas. And we know that in these math conversations, that they could be having this conversation within a small group, one-to-one with a peer in the context of a whole class discussion, or in some very specific math talk routines that the teacher might be using. And I'm sure that many of you have probably seen some of these math talk routines in some of the classrooms in your schools. So if we go to the next slide, what I want to highlight is that the whole idea of math conversation is really moving away from that idea to it being just teacher to student, student to teacher. And as you can see on the next slide, it really is about setting up a whole dialogue and having a shared understanding through mathematical discussion. So in other words, it's student to student and sometimes student to teacher. But in this kind of a way, it's often described as we're sharing the mathematical authority around the room. So again, the kind of thing that as a principal, as you visit a classroom, walk by a classroom, I think it's important to listen to who's talking. So whose voice is being heard? Because we should be hearing all of the student voices within that classroom. It can be noisy, but noise is not a bad thing, particularly if it's around mathematical ideas. So the idea that the authority is shared, it's not just the teacher and a textbook that holds the math knowledge, but the math knowledge is shared throughout the classroom. And if we go to the next slide, we know that quite often math conversations really result from educators asking good questions. Again, these ideas are right in that document. And the good questions are not the kinds of questions that kind of have a one answer, but they're the kinds of questions that really move the students' thinking forward. They provoke discussion, they highlight key concepts. And so the teacher is asking questions not just to find out if they've got the right answer, but the questions are the kinds of questions that are encouraging the teacher to see what is the student's understanding of this idea and how can we build on that understanding. So it involves multiple responses, additional discussion, and it moves that interaction forward. The next slide, please. So I'm going to draw a little bit on this particular monograph that's available to you from the ministry website. It's in one of those What Works documents. And I'm drawing on that because, well, one, I wrote it, but I don't get royalties, but I'm drawing on it because I know this case study really, really well. And it's about how a teacher was able to facilitate discussions, whole class, small group discussions, and the kinds of ways that she went about doing that. If we go to the next slide, it poses a particular question. So in other words, the teacher was going to begin a lesson. She posed this question to the students, and she had them move into small groups and pairs, work with a variety of different kinds of materials, and come up with different ways to approach the problem. So I'm going to give you about a minute to read through the problem, and in the chat pod, maybe jot down some ideas about where a student, let's say in grade 6, might begin with this problem. What might be one of the first things that they do? So I'll give you a minute to add some ideas into the chat pod. You don't need to solve the problem. I'm not giving you enough time to do that, in fact. So if you can just jot down what you think might be some of the students' first moves. So you're a principal, you're walking into this room, you see the problem. What kinds of things might you be seeing the students doing? My purpose is to lead into how the teacher led some discussions about this problem. Any comments? Okay, that might balance equations. Any other ideas?
How do you turn your microphones off? How do you turn this off?
It's off when you put it in the case.
See the lights? It's on right now. How do you turn this off?
Well, when you pull them out, they come on because it'll say power on. I know that they're charging, but
Somebody's
I think this is your problem.
Somebody has their mic on. If they could perhaps turn it off. Thanks a lot. Okay, so we have students talking, drawing a picture, balancing an equation. The students might be in teams, creating different models. With art space, maybe they're building these models. They might be role playing. Okay, you've got lots of great ideas. So as I say, this is the kind of problem, it might be the kind of problem you might want to work with your staff on and think about what might students do, and then think about how might we lead an actual discussion in terms of this problem. And I'm actually going to move forward to the next slide to show you one particular student solution. And I know we've got a short time today and we want to leave time for discussion about how you stimulate conversations within your school. So I'll kind of walk you through this solution. If we look over on the upper left-hand side, first of all, those little circles with the tiny circles on top, those are supposed to be frogs. And you notice that there's the number 20 there. Well, they decided that they would choose the number 20, and we can talk about why. And by choosing the number 20, they thought that each frog then would be worth 5. And since that was equal to 5 fairy godmothers, still using the number 20, they thought that each of those then would be worth 4. You can see there's lots of scratching out, and they had to make different kinds of decisions. So after they worked on that idea that they decided that they would assign these kinds of values, they then moved to round 2 and used those kinds of numbers to figure out what the dragon would be worth. And then they used those kinds of ideas to then think about, well, now that I know what each of these characters is worth, I now can go and I can evaluate round 3 and determine who's going to win. So I'm just kind of walking you through this. Now, this is one of many different kinds of solutions, and not every group solved it the same way. It's quite interesting to see the variety of different kinds of solutions. And this one, I guess I might say, was using kind of proportional reasoning. And if we go to the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about now what the teacher did to connect the mathematical ideas. And I always like to mention resources that I find really handy. This is a resource I have used when working with teachers, and it's called the 5 Practices for Orchestrating Productive Math Discussions, because our whole discussion today is about those kinds of math discussions or conversations. And I'm going to focus on what kinds of things the teacher did to connect the mathematical ideas. Because what the teacher did is she had not everybody present. It wasn't a show and tell, but she very much selected and sequenced. And you can see those as the 2 practices above, connecting who was going to present and why they were presenting. So in other words, it wasn't, let's look at the most effective strategy. No, she actually happened to choose strategies that represented what other students in the class were doing so that they could connect their ideas to those ideas that were being presented, and she could help them connect across. We go to the next slide. We can see that in her facilitating this whole class discussion after the students worked on the problem, as I said, she purposefully selected and sequenced student work so that the work presented showed various strategies that groups had used, and she helped them make those connections. Now, she had been working with them on this whole idea of connecting the ideas after they worked on a problem. Not only did she pose important questions, but she also had gotten the students to be able to pose questions to the presenters. And I know when I interviewed her afterwards and I told her, you know, what great questions the students were asking. And she actually said to me, well, in the beginning, they would ask questions like, so why did you choose red and blue markers? And then they actually developed into, for this particular one, I know I heard a student ask, why did you use the number 20? I mean, we're all probably wondering that as we saw that work. That was kind of a teacher question for this student to be able to say, what made you choose the number 20? So we can see that the students are developing rich questions and not only the teacher. And if we go to the next slide. This is taken, it's kind of a screenshot right from that resource, the High-Impact Instructional Practices. And I find that this might be handy to work with teachers because it says, what are some kinds of questions that you might use at the beginning when you were trying to learn about a concept? And as students progress, what are some kinds of questions that you might include? And when they're deep in the learning, what are some kinds of questions? So again, these are the kinds of question prompts that that would be useful for teachers. And to tell you the truth, when I work with beginning teachers and I'm having them design a lesson in a course I might be teaching, I ask them to actually plan ahead and to write in the kinds of questions that they might ask at various moments in the lesson, because sometimes it's very hard to think about those rich questions right on the spot. And we tend to ask those kind of quick answer questions that are somewhat closed. So planning ahead what kinds of questions to use would be really, really useful. And as I say, this is right in the document. And on the next slide, you'll see there's another resource that I often recommend to people. It's called Principles to Action. And it's from a National Council of Teachers of Mathematics. It's a very handy book. And what I find handy about it is it's good for busy administrators and busy teachers, because I find you can open to any page and it gives you some good ideas. It might give you a chart that you could talk to your staff about. It talks about effective teaching practices. It talks about curriculum. It talks about assessment. It talks about engaging purposeful questions. And so here's a sample of one page where it says on one side, what are the teachers doing here? And what are the students doing? So for instance, I'll just read through one bullet on each side. The teachers are advancing student understanding by asking questions that build on, but don't take over the student thinking. So they build on the student thinking. They don't push it aside and they don't try to narrow it in. And what are the students doing? They expect to be asked to explain, clarify, elaborate on their thinking. So again, pointing to this as a handy resource in terms of questioning. Next slide, please. Thanks. And now I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Anna.
Thanks so much, Chris. We're going to look at another of the 5 practices for orchestrating productive mathematical discussions. And this one involves monitoring the learning. Here what we can see is teachers working with small groups. And boy, this year, they are small groups, aren't they? We can have like 1 to 2 in a small, like physically distant space, or even if we're having online classes, we have our virtual breakout rooms. The key piece that we're seeing with teachers working and monitoring the small group learning is that they're documenting the learning. And essentially what they're writing down is the answers to 2 questions. What are students doing? And what strategies are being used? Small group work is really helpful as well if there's a misunderstanding of the question, and it gives the teacher the opportunity to redirect. Let's take a look at some examples on the next slide. So you remember this question from earlier with Chris. We had the tug of war, 4 frogs on one side tied with 5 fairy godmothers. And then a second tug of war had another tie with 1 dragon versus 2 fairy godmothers and a frog. And the third tug of war was undecided. The next slide has an actual transcript of a discussion between a teacher and some students in a small group. If you don't mind just taking a minute to quickly scan through it and take a look and highlight in your own mind, what are you noticing about the blue teacher prompts that are being asked? If you don't mind taking a minute, just quickly, what came to mind for you? Just put your initial thoughts in the chat. What did you notice about the teacher prompts?
Anna, things are pretty quiet. If you'd like to maybe get that conversation started, that would be a great thing.
You know what? I noticed that too, and we're tired.
There
So
we
thank
go.
you.
We've got some people coming forward. Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Manas.
Yeah. So we've got pointing out the operators. Thank you, Alan. Manaz, you've added teacher prompts are quite narrow, albeit for answers. Doesn't seem open enough. And those are things that come in initially to mind. Let's take a look at the next slide, and maybe we can dissect some of the prompts as well. So if you were doing a principal walkthrough and you heard the teacher say, okay, so can you explain this to me? What the teacher is doing here is opening up the conversation. So in a small group, instead of saying, yep, you got this right, great, keep going, they're actually asking the students to share their thinking. So great move to begin with. On the next slide, we see the follow-up question where the teacher asks, what made you think of unit rates? I love this question because when I saw it and we discussed it as a team, all of us said, wait a minute, Kareem never said unit rates in the answer. The teacher said unit rates, but Kareem didn't. And so as a principal, in your mind, you're thinking, is the teacher leading the conversation? Or in fact, is the teacher giving the students the vocabulary that they need to articulate the math thinking that's happening at that time? And the answer is, as a principal, when you're walking through, you don't know. So what a great opportunity to leave a little Post-it note on the teacher's desk, inquiring about that, or even to use as a follow-up discussion after school or after when you have some time at recess, just to probe that thinking that the teacher's doing and bring it to light. What are they doing and why are they doing it? And the next slide sums up the opportunity for students. So the teacher asks, why does that make sense? And it gives the students the opportunity to justify their thinking and either support their correct thinking or realize that maybe they went down the wrong trail. All of these are opportunities for students to enhance their thinking and to not just move on to another question, but really justify what they're doing. On the next slide, please, Brad. And as I mentioned earlier, we have an opportunity as principals to ask teachers questions in the moment by leaving a little Post-it note or sending them a text or an email, or even following up in person after having done the walkthrough. And some questions that we can use to probe teacher thinking about small groups includes the ones in yellow that you see on your screen. So how might you probe a small group to seek an alternative method? How might you promote student interaction in a small group? What kind of questions might you ask to explain student thinking? And how might you encourage perseverance and share praise? Next slide, please. Our small groups can be either homogeneous or heterogeneous, and they're particularly important when we think about differentiating for students and meeting them where they are at. So this can take place at various points of a lesson and not necessarily just at the end of a lesson. The scaffolding can target the gaps that already exist by engaging prior knowledge or pre-teaching math vocabulary to students. In the tug-of-war example, the small groups were used to extend thinking after the group had time to explore possible solutions. It is important that we give students an opportunity to fail and to have some productive struggle. The art to being an instructional leader as a principal is to probe your teachers to find out why, when, and how groups are formed. This opens up teachers' planning and thinking when you're having personalized conversations with them. Next slide, please. And so once again, we have our wonderful resource from High-Impact Instructional Practices in Math. That's with part of our curriculum that's online. And things that we can be looking at in small group instruction are different as students are beginning to learn about a concept, when they're progressing with their learning, and when students are deep in the learning process. And this is a great reference, well, actually a page to reference as we are looking at groups in our classrooms. Next slide. So just to recap, effective small groups use targeted guided math for specific students at specific times. They use small and flexible groupings. They can be homogeneous or heterogeneous. They include models and representations, guided practice and feedback, and they can focus on concept or process such as problem solving, reasoning, proving, or representing thinking. And small group lessons are really key to our small group. Go back one, thank you. They're really key to working with our small groups. We may need to break down a learning goal and break it into several mini lessons just to make sure that we don't lose track of what the rest of the class is doing at the time. Next slide, please.
Okay. Thank you so much, Anna. So what we're going to do at this time is we're going to take an opportunity to divide into some breakout groups. You will be placed in a group, and the group is going to try to focus the discussion to extend our thinking around small groups and conversations by focusing on these three questions. So how do teachers create small groups and avoid creating inequities? What are the ways that we can support teachers to create small groups that provide space for student thinking for all students? And how can we help teachers use questions that facilitate meaningful mathematics discussion? So your facilitator in your breakout will have these questions to refer to, and the key is to start off a conversation and see if we can dig a little deeper into this topic from an equity perspective. We're going to be gone for about 20 minutes, and then your breakout time will end, and we'll join back together at the end with the full group. So Brad, whenever you're ready, we'll wait for you to divide.